Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So there's the title, okay? Humanity 2.0, a 21st century view of the two cultures problem. First of all, I want to have a sense of the audience here. Let's say we divide up all of knowledge in terms of the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences, and I'd like you to put your hands up only once. How many people here are from the humanities? Okay. How many of you are from the social sciences? For the record, let me say there are very few people from the humanities and quite a lot from the social sciences, if not the majority. How many from the natural sciences? Okay, the natural sciences are number 2 on this list. Okay, the reason why I asked this question is because this topic, right, which really goes to the nature of our being, right, and assuming that we remain humans in the 21st century is going to be very relevant. And there are different takes that those of you who come from the different branches of knowledge will have on it. Okay, so let me begin here. Okay. Here's the question. Have we always, sometimes, or never been human? Okay, I don't want to show of hands here. And what I want to do at the outset is to raise 3 issues that you should think about when trying to answer this question, because this is quite a difficult question, and it's been always a difficult question. I'm someone who was, in fact, originally trained in history and philosophy of science. For the last 15 years, the entire time I've lived in this country, the United Kingdom, I'm an American, I've been a professor of sociology, so I've been based in the social sciences. And I've also done a lot of work in recent years looking at these developments that are often called the Converging Technologies Initiative, right? Nano, bio, info, cogno technologies for enhancing humanity, human performance, or something of that kind, right? So I've been sort of involved in all of the different branches of knowledge with regard to questions having to do with humanity. And let me tell you, having been involved in all these areas, it is very difficult to define what it is to be human. Okay, and so this is why I posed the question this way. And what I want to do is I want to just alert you to 4 points that you should always have in mind when you're thinking about this question. First of all, there's always been an ambiguity about where you draw the distinction between the human and the non-human. And I mentioned Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus is the man in the middle of the 18th century, Swedish taxonomist, who actually coins the phrase Homo sapiens to describe our species. Okay? And even then, it was pretty tough to tell us from the apes. And the issue here, and I think it's very interesting to talk about Linnaeus in this context, because this was a special creationist. And he said, look, if you're just looking externally at the morphology of all the different races of humanity and all the varieties of apes that are known, it is very hard to draw a sharp line where one ends and the other begins. But nevertheless, we do know there is something called humanity that's different. And why do we know this? Well, because of the Bible. That's the only reason why we know. Not because there's some, as it were, clear biological reason for this, but rather because human beings have souls, and we, as human beings, individually can inspect our souls. But, you know, the point is we can't verify that in other individuals. We just assume such individuals exist. Right? Why? Because the Bible tells us. So the Bible becomes an authority on what it is to be a human being. To this very influential, very important biologist. Okay? Now, the problem gets more difficult once you don't believe in the Bible. Right? And as you know today, right, with regard to the overlap, genetic overlap of species and so forth, 90, 95%, etc., it's getting harder and harder to tell the difference between the human and the non-human. And evolutionary psychologists every day are finding out that all kinds of species are supremely sophisticated. Right? And the problem is we've been working with dumb experiments in the past. Right? So the question is, so this idea of there being a distinction between the human and the non-human has always been problematic and is certainly problematic today. The second point I raise is that there's always been a recognition of the diversity of mental and physical characteristics among those qualified potentially to be called human. Right? So some people are smarter than others. Right? Some people, you know, have certain kinds of what might be regarded, you know, more moral than others. Right? Think about the traditionally distinctive human traits that philosophers have talked about. Everybody's always realized there's been variation, and that causes problems. Because what do you do about the variation? Do you just say only those on the top end of the skew are the humans, or not? Okay. Number 3. First, one thing that's been very important is everybody's always realized that not everything about us, either physically or mentally, is necessary for us to be humans, right? We could lose or gain a few things and become more human, right? So we could have a larger cerebral cortex, perhaps. We might want to get rid of some of our undesirable traits. We could even lose some physical traits that at the moment are functional in a fairly limited kind of way. Like, you know, would our humanity be threatened if we grew an extra digit or lost an extra digit, right? And a lot of the discussion around human enhancement presupposes you could still be a human being and nevertheless be enhanced physically or mentally. Okay, and that's a long-standing discussion as well. That's not just tied to the recent developments in biotechnology, genetics, etc. That's always been there. And the fourth one is, and this should be obvious given everything else I've said, is that what it means to be human is a very precious and elusive thing. Namely, there's a lot of value placed on it, but it's quite difficult to actually nail it down, right? And as it were, you can kind of move in and out of it. Like perhaps your mental competence at one point puts you in it and then out of it, right? Your moral actions at one point might put you in it or out of it, right? So what happens then is that you need projects, disciplines, things that actually promote and maintain humanity. That is another constant that you find in the history of this discussion. And that then brings us to what would seem to be kind of the obvious conclusion to reach, namely, humanity is artificial. Okay? And by artificial, I mean this in a positive sense. And maybe that's how you in the audience, I notice mostly young people here, probably most of whom are cyber geeks, that's probably the way you think of it too. But some people don't think of artificial as positive. But humanity is artificial in the sense that it goes beyond just what is required at a natural level for survival. Right? That there's some purposes, there's some goals, there's some ideas, designs, whatever, that in a sense their realization go beyond what's required to survive and reproduce in a sort of Darwinian sense. Right? And generally speaking, anything that a Darwinist finds hard to explain is human. Okay? Now, there are different ways in which one can talk about this. And so we can have sort of, as it were, this periodization is meant to just sort of lay out types for you. I think that the periods, in a way, epitomize these moves, but of course they're all still with us today. There was the first ancient artifice by which we would become human, be made human, and that is what the Greeks call paideia. It's still done today. It's sometimes called education. Maybe some of you have been acquainted with it in your lifetimes. It's a sort of dying art. But what it has to do is trying to get people to inhabit the right mental space in the way they deal with others and the world, right? And that has to do with, you know, things like speaking in complete sentences, looking people in the eye. I mean, it does have, it's a disciplining, right, activity where you become a certain kind of being you might not otherwise be. And it also has to do with the way in which you justify your arguments and your opinions. You just don't say, I feel this, therefore it's true, right? You try to come up with some sort of larger perspective that takes into account other people's points of view, because their points of view are worthy of respect and they need to be incorporated into any kind of understanding of humanity. That's what paideia was all about. So the liberal arts in that sort of traditional classical sense, that's what they were doing. They were trying to construct human beings from the biological species Homo sapiens. And let me tell you, when these guys were doing it in the Greek days, they didn't believe everybody was up to it. Right? Only relatively few people were up to it. But nevertheless, that was the project. The project was to make people into human beings that way. Now, in the Middle Ages, through Roman law, you get this idea of the universitas. Okay? And this is a very special kind of legal category, because if you want to think about how people were organized under Roman law, which was kind of the main body of law that existed from the Middle Ages into the early modern period, right, there were two basic categories before the universitas came into being. On the one hand, you were defined in terms of your family lineage. So you were defined pretty much in biological terms that would not be unfamiliar to a contemporary biologist. So what family you came from, right, what descent you came from, determined how you were dealt with. So did you come from a noble background? Did you come from a serf background, right? That determined how you were dealt with, legally speaking, except in cases where there were projects of temporary duration which were artificial but accomplished an end that was of mutual interest to the people concerned. So, for example, the Crusades. You can't fight all the Muslims unless you've got people from many different classes of Christian society operating, and they have to be able to deal with each other. So you suspend the biological stuff to move into this other space. But once it's over, then you revert to your family the family basis on which you were defined. Okay? So there is no notion of common humanity, no notion of there being a sort of status of humanity above and beyond just where you're, where you were born and how you, and what sort of family you come from. Except when this idea of the universitas comes about. Now, what is the universitas? Well, universities, obviously, guilds, city-states, churches, things of that kind. That is to say something that that extends beyond just one generation. So it has, a life of its own. But the way in which the life of its own is perpetuated is not through the ordinary biological reproductive means of family life, but rather through things like election, selection, examination, things of that kind. Okay? Citizenship tests, for example, right, if you think about states. And the point is that what you are, as it were, becoming when you enter into the identity of being a member of a universitas, you become incorporated, as it were, as an individual, into this larger project that has a goal above and beyond your own individual interests. Okay? And this was regarded, generally speaking, as a humanizing project, and it becomes kind of the template against which things like political parties and socialism and so forth develop in the 19th century. This is kind of the way in which you start to get some kind of conception of this, where you can have people moving, as it were, in a common direction progressively, generation after generation. We often still think of science in these terms, right, where, as it were, you bequeath to the next generation certain things, but you don't do it by traditional biological means. Okay? Now, the modern artifice, which is the sort of thing that we really start to get with the scientific revolution in the 17th century, is engineering, where there's a really clear sense in which you are redesigning the physical environment, and the physical environment including your own body, to realize these goals that are regarded as distinctly human. Right? Now, this is very materialistic in one sense, but the fact that you're thinking about your humanity in a way that's somewhat detached from your current physical existence, so that, as it were, I want my body to be enhanced in a certain way so I can become more human, that implies that your humanity relies on something other than just what your physical situation happens to be. Otherwise, enhancement wouldn't really be it wouldn't be the way you'd go about doing it. Okay? So that's a very important contemporary idea, right? And sometimes what we call transhumanism, okay, which is all this business about trying to, as the bioethicist John Harris says, enhance evolution, right? That is basically a very extreme version of this kind of modern idea. But in a way, it's to realize the traditional goals of humanity, right? You want to, to be intelligent has always been a hallmark of humanity that distinguished us from the apes. Okay, now you want to be really intelligent. And so you're going to enhance yourself. In a sense, it's just a continuation of the same trajectory. That's the point that I'm making there. Okay. The problem with all this wonderful stuff is it's not necessarily good for all flesh and blood humans. And I think that's a very important point. The biggest problem with the project of humanity is it's not really good for all humans. Right? Now, this took a long time to realize. And I think it's really only with the rise of Christianity that people started to get guilty about this fact. Because as I was pointing out in the previous slides, people throughout history, if you look at Greeks, Aristotle, and so forth, people were very used to the idea that there was diversity among the individuals that we would consider to be members of Homo sapiens, and there was no necessary need why everybody had to be, as it were, brought up to a certain level in order to be fully human. I mean, that takes a certain kind of understanding of the entity you're talking about as Homo sapiens. And what, Christianity with its idea of the soul, right, and that we're all children of the same God, then puts a kind of burden to wonder, well, why is it if we're all children of the same God and we have all this divine blessing, nevertheless the material conditions of people are so radically different? Okay? And so when you secularize this idea, right, we get this idea of human potential. Why isn't it realized? So this turns humanity from something that, as it were, just a few people are eligible to do, to something that could in principle be a collective project that we could all be involved in, whereby we are raising up the lower elements of the society. Okay? And this really started to get off the ground in the late 18th century with the rise of the nation state and issues about, raising the overall level of humanity. So when we're worried about things like, gross national product per capita, vital statistics of any kind, right? We are concerned about those matters, right? And this is something, you know, and the sorts of actions that start to get taken during this period, right? The redistribution of wealth and sentiment, right? We start to be concerned about the poor in the way that we weren't before. Later, mass education, generalized health care, and more general presumptions about welfare entitlement. Okay, so in other words, it's not just enough that a few people can make it into the category of humanity. There is an obligation for us to bring all of Homo sapiens into it. This is something invented largely in the late 18th century and, of course, progressed throughout the 19th and 20th century and is currently in decline. Now, there is a lot of skepticism about all this stuff. Okay, and indeed, one of the most interesting aspects of this is that a lot of the skepticism comes from the left, which was traditionally the champion of this, okay? And for the critics, and I'm going to go through the critics in a moment, humanity remains a fantasy whose risks are outweighed by its hypocrisy. Really? Okay. You're lucky you're going to see all this on the web because we're only like halfway there. Okay, maybe this in a way is going to be the way to wrap this up, and I hope you have some questions. There are 6 major arguments that are given this day against the idea of promoting the project of humanity. Okay? Not all of them, but most of them come from the left. Okay? The first one, which was very influential when I was a kid, okay, was Michel Foucault. I trust most of you have heard of Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault's Death of Man thesis that was articulated in The Order of Things back in 1966. The idea here was Foucault basically saw humanity as kind of a thing that had existence for, you know, maybe 100, 150 years, starting in the late 18th century and sort of fizzling out in the by the middle of the 20th century. And the idea here being that this whole idea that humanity as this thing one might strive to do, right, that I've been talking about so far, right, that this is in fact just some weird hybrid, right, exotic apes suffering from the God delusion, right, that we can in some sense become like God and we think we're higher, you know, have a higher station than we in fact do. And in their various ways, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud kind of made this point. In addition, there is also what one might call the generic postmodern critique that is very taken for granted these days about, you know, when people want to be anti-humanist, right, is that really, you know, who are the people who benefit from this idea of promoting the project of humanity? It's the usual hegemonic male elites, right? And so, you know, and you all know that argument. And let me move on to some that you may have not thought of. The neoliberal and the neoconservative critique. That is to say, humanity costs too much and it delivers too little, right? All of this redistribution of wealth to get the poor, right, especially racially, you know, in the case of the United States, the blacks and so forth, what actual benefit has it done in the long run? You know, aren't the sorts of ceilings that one has reached, the kinds of walls that one has reached in being able to actually create a society where people can actually act as full human beings, okay, in that kind of classical sense? Doesn't that show that perhaps there are some biological limits and that race and gender are really real in that sense? Okay, that's been one of the things that's, of course, has come mostly from the right. But there's also the ecological critique of humanity, right? The projects associated with humanity are depleting natural resources, if not endangering the entire biosphere. All of this re-engineering of the planet to our benefit, right? We get global warming, we get all these awful things. There's also the animal rights critique, which is related to it. And that is the fact that we privilege ourselves as a species, right, is based basically on ideas from theology that Darwin has in fact wiped off the slate. And in the process, what we do now, let's say with extensive medical research that uses animals, is that we're causing unnecessary suffering in the world. And we are not necessarily doing anything of any greater benefit except in the short term for ourselves. And then finally, there is the post-humanist critique, okay, that not even human beings want to be with other human beings anymore. Okay? I mean, they prefer animals and pets and, you know, all that kind of stuff. I mean, this is, you know, so you know, those who relate to Peter Singer at a more visceral level, right, with regard to animal rights stuff. And of course, there is this ever-growing issue, which should never be underestimated, of the second self phenomena, where people identify more with their existence in cyberspace than they do with their existence in their normal physical bodies, okay? And so from that standpoint, you know, this whole idea of humanity and the training and the disciplining and all of this kind of concern is just beside the point. As it were, the human beings have left the building, okay? Now, I don't have much time left, do I? No. Okay. Okay, for the benefit, I hope you get a chance to look at the PowerPoint presentation, because there is another, whatever, 5 slides left. But let me close with this, and that is, what are we to make of this, right? Basically, a very wide, cross-ideological rejection of humanism and humanity as a kind of serious concept in our current times. You know, how does one diagnose this situation? Of course, one might say we're getting over childish things. That's obviously one sort of explanation for it. But there may be some others which I would like you to consider. One of them has to do with the fact that the reluctance to admit failure with regard to the project. Namely, there's a sense in which trying to, as it were, solve problems related to poverty, gender inequality, racial inequality, those kinds of issues are very difficult. They may not be as intellectually sexy as certain other things. They are very difficult. They involve a lot of nitty-gritty political stuff, often at very local levels, that perhaps in and of themselves, all the inspiring ideas did come from the 18th and 19th century, but the job still hasn't been done yet. And so it's very easy for people to think, well, let's just write this off and move on to something else entirely. And I do think that sometimes that's what's behind it. And also I think that there is also a concern about what human beings at the end of the day think about each other, issues of sentiment. And here, you know, one cannot, you know, take off the table the idea that there may be some misanthropy going on, where people, you know, are, as it were, do not like the fact that other human beings have, as it were, taken liberties and done these very extreme projects in the past in the name of humanity, only to create such big disasters. And so this then leaves people with a sort of self-loathing attitude toward humanity. I think both of these attitudes are wrong. There is nothing wrong with trying to move, in principle, in a transhumanist direction and in all of this new technology that can enhance this and so forth. But I do think that the original old humanistic projects are still worth pursuing and should not be dropped as an excuse to pick up these other things. And I will stop there.
Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Fuller. We have time for a very, very quick couple of questions, if anybody's got anything. Yeah, oh God, hold on.
Thanks for the lecture. Tom, at the start, of the evening, was talking about how we could move forward and unify as a humanity, as a kind of global civilization, as a culture. Given the critiques you've just raised, do you think that's a possibility?
Oh, I do. No, definitely I do. But I do think the old problems from the 70s are still on the table with regard to the very, maybe not very sexy topics, but, you know, the increasing division of the rich and the poor, which in a way is getting exacerbated by the info-rich and the info-poor. I mean, those problems aren't going away by themselves, okay? And, you know, Jeffrey Sachs and Bono flying around the world isn't enough. Right? There's more than, in a sense, needs to be done about those very essential issues. Because I think, from an ethical standpoint, it's only once we've really addressed those issues seriously that a lot of this more kind of futuristic stuff, which I, at a visceral level, have a lot of sympathy with, okay? I think you can only be morally credible if you're addressing the other stuff as well at the same time. Otherwise, it looks like you're just leaving the poor behind, writing them off now.